Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today as I give my very first book talk. My book is officially being released today in the US. So I'm very excited about that. And it was already released in the UK last month. I would like to thank Shanila Koja for inviting me to give this talk. I'm grateful to ICMU for inviting me to give this talk. I'm, again, a very special day because it's my very, very first book talk. So my book is called Feminism, Tradition, and Change in Contemporary Islam, Negotiating Islamic Law and Gender. I want to talk about the origins of the book, what made me want to pursue this research, and I'll discuss some objectives of the study, and then get into some of the chapters or all of the chapters, just give a general idea of what each chapter is about, and then end with some major findings and conclusions. So this book is based on my dissertation research. I've generally historically been interested in inconsistencies, in complexities, in how traditions originate, how they're defined. I grew up as a Muslim person and especially in academia recently, to this idea of the Islamic tradition, and especially that the Islamic tradition is very nuanced, it's very complex, it's very diverse. And as many Muslim feminist scholars before me have shown, somehow this complexity and this diversity isn't given to this. It doesn't seem to apply to ideas of gender and sexuality. And I'm doing something similar with my book. I wanted to understand how religious traditions and religions by extension are negotiated. I was struck by the 2014 global Muslim response to when ISIS wanted to revive slavery, and the global Muslim community responded with something like, no, that's slavery is absolutely un-Islamic, it's absolutely immoral, it's absolutely unacceptable. And we had a similar response as a global Muslim community to something like Amina Wadud, who led a mixed gender prayer in 2005. And a similar response. This is absolutely unacceptable. Islam does not allow for something like this. Islam has no room for something like this. We're changing Islam. And I noticed this inconsistency. I was starting to notice a pattern by the time that I was a PhD student and pursuing this research. I wanted to understand how change was understood or is understood by both regular lay Muslims today, and also by Muslim scholars today and historically. What are considered to be the criteria for change in Islamic law? I've also been noticing since then and before then as well that in religious traditions generally, in religious communities, there seems to be this pattern of not permitting change on issues of gender and sexuality generally, same-sex relations in most religious traditions, including Christianity and Judaism, and of course in Islam, are perceived as untouchable. We cannot change this. We cannot negotiate with this. The tradition, the religions the sacred textbooks are really clear on this. So I wanted to see if there might be a pattern that might explain when we as a religious community are open to change and when we're not. So my primary research question is what do lay Muslims understand to be the criteria for changing historical positions of scholarly consensus? And this idea of consensus is going to be really important to my book, Ijma in Arabic. How do Muslims decide when past Islamic legal precedents, positions of consensus are open to renegotiation and when they must remain unaltered? A lot of Muslims will insist that something like context is relevant. Of course, slavery is immoral today. Of course, slavery is wrong today. Yeah, it may have been permitted in the past, but context was different. Yeah, child marriage is illegal or wrong today. It's immoral today. In the past, it was allowed because that was the context of the time. But somehow, I was noticing we don't seem to be applying this idea of context to gender issues. And so I'm interrogating in this book why context is invoked, why and how context is invoked, for what particular cases, and again, interested in patterns. And so I'm going to be in both in this talk and in the book. What I do is I challenge this idea that there's a mainstream Islam, that Islam and the Islamic tradition and Islamic law, whatever these terms mean, because it turns out they're really hard to define, actually, that these terms, these concepts are fixed, settled, and not open to renegotiation. One of the things that I do differently in this book that I wasn't seeing enough of in academic scholarship in Islamic studies, in studies of Islamic law, in Quranic studies, was a focus on lay people, lay Muslims. So I'm putting regular Muslim people, lay Muslims, in conversation with scholarly authorities, both mainstream scholars, academic scholars, and historical scholars of Islam. Okay. What I do with my question primarily is I'm using certain gender issues, all of them turn out to be gender issues, as a case study to approach this question of change. I'm exploring generally in the ways that Sunni, again, I want to be very clear that this is about Sunni Muslims, Sunni American Muslims, how they're approaching questions of change, tradition, and gender in Islamic law. The issues that I deal with are female-led mixed gender prayers, women's marriage to non-Muslims, and female inheritance, all of which are perceived as somehow not negotiable. Whatever the Islamic tradition historically has said on these issues, we must maintain today, is the perception that we seem to be getting. And then the other two issues I deal with are child marriage and sexual slavery. Those are apparently very, very negotiable. Context becomes relevant there. Contemporary Muslims can and should change their opinions on those issues. I want you to understand why. How do we decide which issues are open to negotiation and which issues are not open to negotiation? And how do I pursue this project? My general methods. I do a textual analysis of the Quranic verses when relevant, because Quranic verses aren't going to be relevant with all of these issues. The Quran has nothing to say on women or anybody leading prayers. And so I have to then deal with the Islamic legal tradition and some legal texts and contemporary opinions, scholarly opinions on these issues, hadith reports, social media content analysis. And then I interview 40 Sunni Muslims in Texas about all of these issues. And the way that I did that interview and they were really long, detailed interviews. I would ask them what they knew about the subject of, say, female inheritance or child marriage or sexual slavery, what they think the Islamic position is, if there were any discrepancies in their understanding between the quote-unquote Islamic position and what their position was, and if there might be any ways that they would rationalize that. And then I ended the interview with this final question of what they consider to be the primary criteria for change, because that was the ultimate question that I wanted the answer to. I had some assumptions when I began to pursue this research. There were particular things that I thought would come up more. So initially, and actually in my dissertation, I think of female inheritance as a sort of somewhere in the middle. It's not completely negotiable, and it is not completely non-negotiable. And the reason that I did that was that I had suspected, and I ended up finding out too, that a lot of my respondents didn't seem to have any issue with the fact that the Quran, that they were disagreeing. The majority of them were disagreeing with a very simple and, in my opinion, very simplistic reading of the Quranic verses on female inheritance, that the Quran very clearly says girls, daughters get half the share of the inheritance of their brothers, of sons. And most of my respondents completely disagree with that, but they didn't have any problems. They didn't think this was a problem. And I was struck by that because they seemed very hesitant to offer positions that disagreed with the Islamic tradition generally in many other areas, female-led prayers, for example, or women's marriage to non-Muslims. And I'll talk about why I think this happened, why I think there was a lack of concern for them, that they might be disagreeing with a very obvious, a seemingly obvious reading of the Quran. I didn't think at all when I first started the study about how age matters, of course, but I didn't think about the extent to which something like generation might affect the results of my study. And I say this because I found something different than what I was expecting. And I'll show my results later near the end of this presentation. But I was imagining, for example, that older Muslims might be a lot more resistant to something like women marrying non-Muslims. And it turns out it wasn't that simple. Age and generation/age and personal experiences and gender, all of these things ended up mattering, and whether my respondents had kids, daughters of their own or not. So many other factors ended up affecting their answers, or my overall answer to the question of how are we deciding what gets to change with time. And as I did expect that personal experiences would be a huge factor in determining the conclusions of the study. And that was very much the case. I just thought that gender might be a lot more relevant. And it turns out the individual person's gender wasn't as relevant as I thought it might be. So I'm going to provide an overview now of the individual chapters. My first chapter is it's called a rhizomatic approach to Islam. And here what I do is I ask exactly what Islam is. I'm defining and redefining what the word Islam means. I ask what the word Islamic tradition means. Academic scholars use the term Islamic tradition a lot more than your average Muslim person might. There's a lot of reasons for that, but I was interested in where this nuance is. Again, Muslim scholars, preachers, mainstream preachers, academic scholars, everybody's insisting that there's nuance, and I wanted to find what this idea of nuance was, and this diversity as well. What I do in this chapter is I don't think I'm doing anything brand new, except simply identifying this idea that Islam is diverse and complex, etc., by giving it the term rhizomatic. I think it's a rhizomatic approach to the Islamic tradition. What do I mean by this rhizomatic? So this is a Deleuzian metaphor. French theorists, an idea came up that French theorists came up with, that something like a religion, in this case Islam, is a rhizome. Rather than something with one root, it has multiple roots. It is a lot more complex. So a rhizomatic model engages interconnectedness in such a way that selectively choosing from traditions and from multiple traditions, because Islam has multiple traditions within it, that appears natural to practitioners of religion. In other words, we know everybody is picking and choosing from religious traditions. Not one individual, I don't think any one person ever is consistent in how they follow a religious tradition. They're not consistent if they're providing a literal reading of a sacred text. They're not doing that consistently. They're not doing that to every issue. They're doing that to some issues. And so, and I don't think that's a bad thing. And that's one thing that I think I provide. This book is sort of a case study of how that's actually necessary. We need to be picking and choosing. Traditions cannot survive if we were that consistent. If change was even, change is just not even. And so the idea of a rhizomatic model simply provides it identifies this phenomenon, the phenomenon of everything is complex. Islam is huge, it's vast, nothing is frozen in time, and that we are responsible for changing things in accordance with our context. So that's what chapter 1 is doing. There are several key components. In chapter 1 is also discussing these several key components of what constitutes a tradition. So something like stratification or flexibility, it's stratified. Traditions are layered, and there's a lot of flexibility. There are political and historical contexts and contingencies. Imagination is a very big deal. Nostalgia is romanticizing the tradition becomes a really important part of building and rebuilding traditions. And what I do then is that when I talk about this the stratification component of a tradition, just to give you an example of how of some of the details in the chapter in this chapter are. What happens is, as we build religious traditions, nothing is fixed. The tradition is not fixed. It's a very complex phenomenon, though. The tradition is not fixed. My generation is going to build on the previous generation's idea, and the previous generation is building on and disagreeing with the previous generation's ideas, and so on. We attribute meanings to what the previous generations have said. We disagree with them. We reject something that they've said. We change some of the stuff that they've said. And historically, this was never in Islamic law, in Islamic tradition, this was never considered a problem. Colonialism is going to have a huge impact on how we're defining Islam and the Islamic tradition, and what we're going to be open to negotiating and not negotiating. Partly because that's a long, detailed story that I do discuss in chapter 1 of the book. But colonialism, I don't think we can underestimate the impact of colonialism on treating Islamic law and Islam and the Islamic tradition as frozen in time, in a specific time that nobody can really put their hands on. We don't know when the borders of when the boundaries of Islamic law start and when they end. And then there's another section of that same chapter. That's where I talk about Muslims, my respondents' definitions of Islam. I ask them questions like, what are the sources of Islam for you? Or when you have a question, what source do you turn to the most? And terms like the Sunnah and Islamic law and Islam. And again, they don't use the word Islamic tradition. When I first asked them about Islamic law, they all seemed to know what I meant by Islamic law. But as I'll discuss in just a bit, as I got to specific chapters, they all wanted me to specify what I meant by Islamic law. So when I said, for example, when I asked them for their position on child marriage in Islam, or their own positions on child marriage or sexual slavery, and the Islamic position, they did ask me what I meant by Islamic law there. So I thought that was really, really fascinating and important. I won't give a specific details of chapters 2 and 3 of the rest of the chapters in detail, but I do want to mention that chapters 2, 3, and 4 are the first section of the book, and that's where I discuss the negotiables. This is sexual slavery, child marriage, and female inheritance. All of these chapters provide a historical overview of these topics. How have Muslim scholars historically addressed these issues, including Quranic verses when relevant, Quranic verses on these issues, and my analysis of those verses, and then commentaries on those verses. And then I provide the contemporary overviews. Generally speaking, what are some major Muslim scholars saying about these issues? And how I decided which individual scholars and preachers I was going to engage in my study depended on who was being cited the most or referenced the most by my respondents. And those three folks primarily happened to be, it was primarily Yasir Qadi and Nouman Ali Khan. This is before Nouman Ali Khan was outed for some of his problems. But although my respondents didn't really cite any women or reference any women, the one woman who many of them would name when I asked for a female scholar, if they follow a female scholar, for example, if they follow scholars, like who their favorite scholars are is what the question was, and they would only name men. And then when I would ask if there were any women, some of them would say Yasmin Mujahid. And so what I did then was to do some research on what are these individual scholars and teachers and preachers saying about these issues. So that was for whenever relevant, because they didn't all have stuff to say about all of these issues. And the female inheritance chapter, again, it was really interesting because this is where the majority of mainstream scholars or the majority of Muslim scholars seem to be agreeing with the historical idea of female inheritance. Girls get half the share of boys, but my respondents disagree with that. And most of them they didn't see there to be a problem between what they were saying and what the Quranic idea seemed to be, because they were like, no, God would understand. Context has changed, or my context is different than what the Quran is assuming here. And so that's what I do in those chapters. Some of the major findings, as I mentioned earlier, when I asked my respondents for their positions on these issues, and I asked also if they knew what the Islamic positions were, what the position of ijma, the Islamic scholarly position might have been, and if it's open to change. Can lay Muslims disagree with the ijma on child marriage? The ijma on child marriage being largely, the idea is that the majority of scholars historically said it's okay to even force a child into marriage without their consent, as long as the guardian was okay with it. So the guardian got to determine who the child would marry, and the child could then divorce when they reached an age of maturity. But the Islamic tradition does not seem unclear about that. There's very little nuance when it comes to, can children be forced into marriage? And the same thing with slavery. Everybody agreed slavery, everybody treated slavery as a common, normal thing. So this is the enslaver's perspective. Most likely from the perspective of the enslaved, they would have very much disagreed with it. But the idea being that the historical tradition takes for granted something like the existence and the normalcy of something like child marriage and slavery. And so that's what I mean by the position of consensus. That's the reality. What do my respondents think today about those issues? And they seem to really, really be horrified that anybody would think it was ever okay in Islam to force a child to marry or to enslave somebody, to have sex with somebody that you enslave, and what we would use the word rape today because of the lack of consent issue. Most of my respondents were, when they found out later after the interview, they were shocked that Islamic law would ever be okay with something like that. And so in that context, then, we do change Islamic law because the scholars were wrong. And the scholarly opinions are not binding. We don't have to accept those positions today, is the idea. And because they asked me what I meant by Islamic law in the context of slavery and child marriage, right? They didn't ask me at other times. They didn't ask me what I meant by Islam or Islamic law when I said, what do you think is the Islamic position on women marrying non-Muslim or women leading mixed gender prayer? They didn't ask me what Islam meant there. They didn't ask me what Islamic law meant there. And so clearly they see Islamic law as complex and Islamic law as changeable. It gets to change with time. It gets to change from context to context, from topic to topic. That was really, really fascinating and essential to some of the findings in the book. And then chapters 5 and 6 are the second section of the book. And this is where I explore the non-negotiables. Chapter 5 is on women's marriage, Muslim women's marriage to non-Muslims, by which I mean specifically people of the book, because the Quranic verses seem to be allowing men to explicitly to marry people of the book, Christians and Jews, we assume, because the Quran doesn't say Christians and Jews, it just says people of the book. And but it doesn't say anything about women not being able to do it. And the conclusion has been, the majority of scholars have decided that means no, they cannot do it. Silence, conveniently, in that case means prohibition. It doesn't always mean a prohibition. And then chapter 6 is on female-led mixed gender prayers. And this is the most fascinating one because there's no textual prohibition against Muslim women, against women leading mixed gender prayer. But this is also the one where I received the most resistance from my respondents. I had, for example, a lot of my respondents got angry, visibly angry when I was asking my questions about this issue. And the questions were, again, there was a pattern to all the questions. What do you think? What do you think Islam has to say on this? How do you know what you know? And then, what do you think it should be allowed, right? Or what do you think the consensus is, or do you agree or disagree with the consensus? And then ultimately, what are the criteria for change? But a lot of them got visibly angry that we were talking about this, and many of them used the words that's not relevant, that's not urgent. Slavery is relevant, and child marriage is relevant. It's urgent. They're oppressive. They're horrible. What's wrong with not letting women lead prayers? So what do they lose? A lot of them didn't think this was relevant. And so this almost visceral response to, what do you think about female-led mixed gender prayer? What do you think Islam has to say on this? Can women go ahead and lead prayers? Should the consensus change on this? That was a really fascinating response from my audience. It received the most resistance. And then I was trying to figure out why this resistance was there, and I discussed that in my conclusion. Because Islam is clearly, suddenly, and only it seems, when it comes to female-led mixed gender prayers, that's when Islam is treated as a fixed thing. The tradition becomes ossified here. It's frozen in time here. You can't change anything. You can't touch this. Our hands are tied here. And the irony to me is that this is the one case where there's no textual sources for the prohibition. There's no scriptural evidence for the prohibition whatsoever. It's simply scholarly positions, scholarly opinions. And even then, I mean, a lot of scholars in the past ninth century, 10th century, 12th centuries were completely okay with something like women leading mixed gender prayers. And a lot of Muslims today we don't have a lot of information on that. People don't know that. So that doesn't help. And then chapter 5, also one of the interesting things that happens in chapter 5, this is where I'm talking about Muslim women's marriage to non-Muslims, is that this is where lived reality, personal experiences with the prohibition became really relevant. Single women, Muslim women who were single, were the most likely, all of them said that women should be allowed to marry non-Muslims. And single men, the majority of single men, like except just one or two, insisted that women not be allowed to marry non-Muslims. And this is where personal experiences and privilege become really important as well. There's a lot at stake for Muslim men if they're going to be permitting women to marry, if we're going to permit women to marry non-Muslims. They don't have enough women to choose from, probably. But single women, and this is really important, single women who, all of them said we should be allowed to marry non-Muslims, but, and there was a really important qualifier here. The condition is only when Muslim scholars decide to change the consensus. The current consensus is binding, the current consensus being, nope, women can't do it. So it's binding until the scholars change it. And the interesting thing was that nobody, except for one person of the 40, nobody gave me the name of a female scholar or a female preacher or a female person in a position of authority that they follow. And so ultimately, basically what happens is, yeah, Islam can change with these positions can change with time, as long as a bunch of Muslim male scholars decide that it can change. And the question of relevance becomes really important, because what if the male scholars aren't convinced that these issues are relevant enough to open up for a conversation? So that's this question of relevance then brings me to my conclusion, which in the book title, The Politics of Negotiation and Relevance, right? And here I begin with two quotes. The chapter begins with two quotes from my respondents, but I'll just mention one quote from a respondent of mine. This is somebody who is a married woman, a married Muslim woman in her 30s. And when I ask her the question of what do you think counts as a legitimate reason to change a historically established position, she says, and I quote, "I want to say social norms, but is that really good enough? As a society, as a Muslim, is that really a good enough impetus for change where we're following the example of a society that we live in? Shouldn't we be questioning our ethics and morals and setting precedents for others, for non-Muslims? Why should slavery be wrong just because it's illegal in the US? Should we, as Muslims, really only be allowing or disallowing things after everyone else has reflected on them? I mean, are we just saying no to child marriage today just because it would make Muslims and Islam look backwards if we didn't?" End quote. And she reflected on this for a long while, and she was struck by this, and she didn't know what to say anymore, as she told me, because she was like, oh my God, because she noticed herself the pattern, and she saw that she had said no to some of the times when the position of consensus is not negotiable. When the position of the consensus is binding, but she said yes at other times, and she was like, that's not fair, right? Why are we going to allow for Muslim women to marry non-Muslims when every religion and every other group of people in the world start being okay universally with interfaith marriage or intercultural marriages? Should we allow Muslim women to lead mixed gender prayer only when all of the rest of other religious traditions and communities become okay with women leading prayers? Right. So that was something her reaction was really, really insightful and very powerful. And we had a long conversation about that afterwards. So some of my findings then essentially are that the authority, authority is gendered, and that's not a new finding. I'm not unique. My book is not unique in that point, but I do provide a lot of evidence for how authority is perceived as gendered. Even if we don't explicitly say women can't be scholars of Islam, we're clearly and subconsciously, and we've internalized that idea. If my respondents aren't giving me the names of female scholars or Muslim women that they take seriously, whose knowledge they take seriously, then there's something going on there with our idea of gender. But also the fact that what we see as relevant and not relevant. I mean, when an issue is a very, very explicitly gendered, but it doesn't seem to be making Muslims look bad, right? Or if it only has an impact on Muslim women, then we don't think of it as that relevant. And clearly, consensus can change, right, if scholars decide to allow for that change. And this is where I have a chart that I wanna show to my audience here, because I think it's a very powerful illustration of what exactly Muslims see as open to change. So in this chart, in this table, this is from page 306 of my book. What happens is this is a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being completely disagree and 5 being completely agree. What I've done here is in the very introduction of the interview, I asked them, what do you think of the position of ijma, scholarly positions? Is it binding on Muslims? Meaning, do Muslims have to respect and honor the scholarly positions of the historical scholars at all times, in our time today as well? That was a general question. In general, what do you think? And then note how it changes from topic to topic. So from slavery and child marriage and female-led mixed gender prayer and then women's interfaith. And note how the number, I mean, it's a significant difference there. For those of us who are completely okay with it, generally, suddenly we became not okay with it when it comes to women's marriage to non-Muslims, or when it comes to female-led prayers. So that's I think that's something really important that I'm showing here. The conclusion is also very much on this question of the politics of relevance. I connect my findings and this idea of that. Let's not talk about female-led prayers. This is not a relevant issue. It's not an urgent issue to the larger resistance to feminist issues, or things or issues that are perceived as feminist, perceived as gendered. We think somehow maleness isn't gendered, but only things that are female or femaleness has gender. And so what I do when I say connected to larger issues is that if we're going to assume that the rationale here for change, it has to do with context, or it has to do with the relevance, or it has slavery had a negative impact on society. That's why we changed it. But the assumption there seems to be that not permitting or prohibiting women from marrying non-Muslims doesn't have a negative impact on Muslim women's lives, or prohibiting them from leading mixed gender prayers doesn't have a negative impact on their lives. And I connect this to a larger trend in academic scholarship, in academia, where feminist scholarship is very much marginalized and it's treated as irrelevant and unrelatable. There's a lot of scholarship showing more recently, especially by Dr. Keisha Ali, where, for example, Dr. Ali does this studies on how many times are we citing Muslim women's scholarship or women's scholarship in Islamic studies. Other scholars have done similar studies in their own disciplines and fields as well. So for me, it's not simply, for me, this question of how are we understanding Islam and how are we understanding change is a question that appears also in larger academic spaces, not necessarily about not necessarily about Islam, but in general with how we treat gendered issues and gender in general, and women's existence and women's presence. And one of the most important, I think, findings that I provide in this book is that we've got, to the larger question of what gets to change with time, et cetera, we've got gender, we've got generation, we've got lived reality, we've got marital status, all of these different things, but especially personal experience, lived reality. Privilege, we want to maintain our privilege when we have it, and we are very greedy with it, very selfish with it. We don't want to share it. Hence, why a lot of the majority of my male single Muslim men were unwilling to extend the privilege of marriage to non-Muslims to Muslim women. There's the role of the ulama that's really fascinating in this study. Muslims, my respondents weren't just evenly relying on Muslim scholarship. They're questioning things, they're disagreeing with their scholars. They have their favorites and they'll tell me this is my favorite, but I disagree with person X on this. But at other times, they're very, very clear. I need to know what the scholars have to say on this, and I'm going to consult my sheikh on this. So it was really interesting to see when they thought the scholar's opinion matters, when it was simply, oh, I'm curious to see what my favorite scholar thinks on this, but I'm not necessarily going to find it binding. I'm not going to apply that to my own life. And then other times when they were like, no, I completely disagree with that. Most of my respondents thought it was completely unacceptable for any Muslim scholar to say that a Muslim woman cannot lead even other women in prayers. So I asked them, do you think women should be allowed to lead women in prayer? And most of them were like, yeah, of course, that's a no-brainer. Except in the tradition, it is not a no-brainer. And so then later after the interview, when we would talk about it, they were shocked to find that that the scholars would have a problem with women leading other women in prayer as well. And then they would say, definitely disagree with that. I'm not accepting that at all. So there was a lot of interesting stuff there as well. And then finally, I think there's a discrepancy, and this is my final conclusion that I want to mention here. There's very clearly a discrepancy between what mainstream, or I'm using the word mainstream here, and I recognize that I complicate that term, but what mainstream scholars, Muslim preachers, popular social media preachers seem to assume about what the community wants, what Muslim women want, what Muslim men want and need, and what the lay Muslim community themselves want and think. And that's where I think as I said, the relationship between the ulama slash my respondents' favorite Muslim scholars and preachers and teachers and what they think about a certain issue. Female inheritance is the case where we see that in really, really explicit detail. They're very much disagreeing with what the scholars have to say, and they don't seem to care. They're like, I don't care that the scholars think this. I know what God means here, and I'm going to apply that to my life. So I'm going to stop right here, and I would love to hear any questions that people have.